This is Jumping In, the short-form series of the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Each week I have the opportunity to speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, those dedicated to winning no matter the challenge. Our long-form series has been an opportunity to go deep, unpack all aspects of our guest and their story. For Jumping In, just like our Jedburgh teams of World War II, I want to get on and off the drop zone fast. I want to catch up with previous guests, give my opinion on what's happening in the world, and uncover some of today's most pressing issues. The entire Jedburgh podcast is sponsored by Jersey Mike Subs. Together, we share the mission of giving back and building community together. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. Check out our website for full transcriptions of every episode at jedburghpodcast.com. Follow us on social media at Jedburgh Podcast on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Subscribe to us wherever you listen to your podcast and watch our full video versions on YouTube. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.
Whereas Abe was able to play the inside game. He understood where the bodies were buried, and he made compromises, which everybody does, but he did them in a really strategic way so that incrementally, people would say, oh, that's not that big a change. Over 8 years, you make enough incremental changes, you've changed the country. And so I think, to me, that's a lot of the lesson of Abe.
Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated on July 8th. Japan is one of the world's safest countries, has some of the strictest gun laws, and has lived by a culture of pacifism since the end of World War II. I'm fascinated by presidencies and what it takes to lead on the world stage. We see it every day in our country abroad, how countries interact with each other. I asked Boston University professor Bill Grimes to join me for a conversation on Prime Minister Abe, his conservative policies on national defense and economics, his place in Japan's history of charismatic leaders, and where Japan goes from here internationally and domestically. Professor Grimes teaches international relations and political science. He's authored a number of books on Japanese politics and economics, and he served at the Japanese Ministry of Finance and at the Bank of Japan. Take a listen and subscribe on all podcast platforms, or watch the full video version on YouTube. Follow us and give us a like on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and TikTok. Being a world leader is one of the hardest jobs in leadership. We owe a debt of gratitude to all of those who raised their hand and answered the call to serve their nation's people. Bill, Professor Grimes, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Nice to be here.
I appreciate you taking a few minutes with us. An unfortunate event has occurred within the last week, and that's the assassination of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan. We are embarking on the podcast on an exploration of our ability to have meaningful conversations with leaders across academics and so many different industries that are pertinent to the most relevant topics of the day. And I was a student, as I was explaining to you before we started. I was a student at Boston University. You are a professor at the Department of International Relations. You're the former head of the department. You were the first director of the BU Center for the Study of Asian Affairs. You focus on Japanese politics and Japanese economy. You're the author of a number of books on these subjects. You were a researcher at Japan's Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan, and you're a life member of the Council of Foreign Relations. And as this event happened, when I studied international relations and I studied political science at Boston University, the presidency was my focus. And it's something that I've been so just involved with, the idea of the presidency in any country my entire life. This really struck home for me. And I thought there's no better person to bring in to have a conversation than you about this event, its effect on international politics, Japanese politics, all of the things that the Prime Minister was seeking to achieve that so many of his predecessors and those around him are continuing to advance, because he really changed Japan and the world in so many ways. But this has been characterized as an event that will change the nation forever. Why is that?
So I wonder sometimes about whether it will have as big a change as people think. So it kind of depends. There's three types of discussions that people have been having about this. And one of them has to do with how do we feel about safety of politicians? What will this do to that very, very personal exchange that you often have in Japan between elected officials and people? I've seen them at I've walked by an Abe speech at a train station just inadvertently one time. I've seen people in clubs, on the subway. The level of intimacy, even though if it may not seem it, is actually quite high. So one question is, are we going to see movement towards violence? But I think that's not the question you're asking. I think the real question you're asking is, are the types of reforms and the type of politics and initiatives at the international relations levels that Abe was associated with going to be continued, going to be continuable? And I think the answer is yes. I think that that Abe for a long time was much more forward-leaning on issues of nationalism, on issues of not military assertiveness, but increased Japanese responsibility for defense and willingness to step into regional issues, and also his program known as Abenomics, which was largely a kind of a liberal, market-oriented approach to reforming the Japanese economy. But these have now become kind of commonplace. I think they're all of these elements are much more normed. If you look at polls of young people, if you look at the polls of the Japanese population as a whole, if you look at the platforms of Japanese political parties, that center has shifted. And so 20 years ago, Abe was way right. He was quite nationalist. He was sort of denied Japan had been an aggressor or had been involved in forcible prostitution among colonized women. He almost single-handedly stopped the process of North Korean Japanese rapprochement because of his hard line on Japanese abductees. But over time, he mellowed a lot. He shifted his own. He dialed back his own personal passions for these things, and became quite a pragmatist. So the Abe that we ended up with the second time around, he was prime minister briefly in 2005, 2006. Prior to that, he had an important position as chief cabinet secretary. But the Abe that we saw after, say, 2013 or 2014 was a pragmatist, an internationalist, was seeking to improve relations with China. He was very forward-leaning on cooperation with Russia. Not that really worked. Yeah. So I think that the ground has shifted a lot, such that that the basic story of Abe doesn't disappear. The question is whether it can be done effectively.
So the consensus is that a lot of the political leaders right now in Japan continue to promote these. I want to ask about the national defense piece of this, because I think it's really important, because after World War II, it was a policy of pacifism. And that was what took hold. That was written into policy, written into the Constitution. And what you saw with Abe was an attempt to reverse a bit of this, to the creation of the self-defense forces. But where this becomes really interesting is that the 41-year-old man who assassinated him, was a 3-year member of the Maritime Self-Defense Forces, and an organization that Abe himself was trying to promote and get out there. And so you saw that situation. But then there's also this, you talked about, does it lead to increased violence? I mean, this is one of the safest countries in the world. They have 127 million people. There's less than 10 gun deaths per year. So how does this situation affect those types of policies?
Well, I think Abe falls into a long-term trend. So, as you said, the post-war Constitution, which was imposed by Americans, has this thing called Article 9, which states that Japan forever renounces the right to belligerency and the use of war as a form of foreign policy. I forget the exact wording. Paragraph 2 says, to this end, armed land, sea, and air forces will never be maintained. So it sounds pretty unambiguous. Depending on where you put the comma.
Pretty clear.
But depending on where you put the comma, though, it's a little more ambiguous than you think. So in Japanese, it could be read as land, sea, and air forces for the purposes of belligerency, blah, 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 shall not be maintained. And so Japan, since the early 1950s, has been slowly growing quite a substantial military force. And until China really started its naval buildup 10, 15 years ago, Japan had arguably the second most capable Navy in the entire world. But And it's got a pretty small army. It's got a very capable air force. But there's two things that are sort of key to understanding Japanese, the sort of shackles on the Japanese military. One is it was defined as purely defensive defense, which means that Japan never developed strike capabilities. There's no cruise missiles. There's no landing capabilities. All of those things that you would be very familiar with, much more so than I.
No
They don't
invasion
exist.
capability.
Yeah, right. You
Attack
have fighter jets, but you don't have bombers. You don't have long range bombers, even when you start having a little bit of minimal, fighter bomber type capability. And so there's a whole series of these things that Japan's not really capable of offensive action. And then the other thing is, and this may well be something you encountered in your own career, is that the U.S. and Japanese military are tightly intertwined. So the Japanese military operates really only as a supplement to the U.S. military force. So all of these things have been sort of growing over time, and Abe was certainly on the sort of more forward leaning, more willingness to engage in military, to put the Japanese military out there and to confront China. And so that made him quite controversial. But if you look at the sort of the long-term trend of greater capability, greater military spending, that one has shifted rather considerably over time anyway. So that a lot of the concern about Abe was both like, we really think people thought he's a militarist, he's a nationalist, he's a historical revisionist. So there's this sense of intention. And then there was was a 2015, 14-15 debate over the roles and missions of Japanese military, and they expanded the set of roles and missions in which Japanese military could operate, in a larger region than just defense of Japan. And so, but what they really want, as you've said, is to eliminate or some people really want, is to eliminate that constitutional bar, which remains important, right? That requires the purely defensive defense.
How does this work with regard to China? Because you mentioned that he was a proponent of increasing their positive relations with China on an economic front, but also on a defense front, he was very weary of China's aggressive tactics in the region.
That's right. It's a contradiction that is.
What's the same one we're in?
Kind of, yeah. It's inherent to the region, right? Korea is facing a very similar story, right? They don't want to be dominated by China, but it's by far their largest trading partner, and they're smaller, and they're right next door, and everything that they deal with on North Korea, they have to worry about China as well. So. That contradiction is kind of unavoidable. So, but the Abe approach was thinking about it like that if you can prevent being sort of pushed around or bullied, that you can then build a more comprehensive relationship in which economics is part of it, and you have everything ranging from competition to cooperation to hopefully not too much confrontation. But this goes way back, this desire to prevent Chinese sort of encroachment and pressure.
So you have spent a considerable amount of your career focused on the region and the geopolitical aspects of the region. So full disclosure, I was in 10th Special Forces Group, so I dealt with Russia and I dealt with Europe, and I spent a lot of time in Africa and the Middle East. So it's a different group. It's the first group who deals with that region of the world. And so outside of travel there for business school and some work-related events, I have not spent a tremendous amount of time in the region. How do you assess Japan's place in the regional international environment right now? Because if I think back to the President Obama days, where he talked about this shift to the Pacific and this focus that we were going to put on the Pacific Rim, we can argue if we actually truly followed through with that or if we got sidetracked with a lot of other different things. But Japan is one of the largest strategic partners when in the economy, in defense, in so many different ways with the United States, one of the strongest economies in the world. As this region, as tensions with countries like China grow on a global scale, as Russia starts to, with the involvement in Ukraine, has certainly put Russia front and center as as an adversary for so many in the world right now. Where does Japan go from here with regard to their dominance and their place in the region, and then also in world politics more broadly?
Yeah, that's a really important question, right? So Japan, if you start from the U.S. perspective, Japan is absolutely the linchpin of U.S. Asia-Pacific strategy. It's the place where we have the largest amount of nuclear forces. It's the place we have the tightest economic relationship. Because of the importance of sea lanes, that cooperation with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, which is what they call the Navy, is extraordinarily important. Going down into Southeast Asia, also Coast Guard cooperation. Japanese Coast Guard cooperation has been, building up the capabilities of Southeast Asian countries. Excuse me. So Japan is the linchpin of U.S. strategy in the Asia Pacific. It's our western end of the Pacific. And so at the same time, Japan is becoming economically weaker relative to China. China's military buildup has been extraordinary, and its willingness to intimidate in territorial terms is also pretty impressive. So South China Sea with the islands down there, the Parasols and et cetera, and then in the East China Sea between Japan and China, the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands, and of course the Taiwan Strait issues. And all of those are there's an outward pressure, and the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy, has really been the centerpiece of growth of Chinese military capabilities. So Japan's kind of on the losing side of this, right? If you think size, demographics, growth potential, all of those things, how do you maintain for Japan? How do you maintain your autonomy in this situation? And what they've done is they've just consistently tried to lean closer and closer to the United States, and that's been particularly over the last 20 years. So that shift, that push to get to more tightly entwined with the United States has been key to Japanese military policies, security policy, political policies. And Japan's also been a real region builder throughout East Asia. So they've been central to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Which the U.S. pulled out of under Trump.
Which the U.S. pulled out of. There's financial cooperation. There's a whole series of technical cooperations that Japan is a major provider of aid, investment, infrastructure, you name it, all through East and Southeast Asia. And so, but it's increasingly understanding that its dominant position in the Asia Pacific is over, and so that it needs to work with partners. And so it's really built out this idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific. The Quad, which is cooperation with the United States, Australia, and India. All of those things are efforts to try to bind the countries like-minded countries. So United States, Australia, India, parts of Southeast Asia like Singapore into a friendly matrix that's not necessarily meant to contain China, because that would be a problem. Yeah. And the Southeast Asian countries have literally no interest in picking sides, but to create a web of institutions that make everybody act nicely, and that's really been the Japanese strategy. And Abe shifted from a more confrontational approach to pushing back on China to really trying to build these cooperative arrangements while constraining China. And so that's the core to Japanese strategy in East Asia, and it's the core also to what you were talking about of U.S. strategy, except that the U.S. has not been consistent about it. Mm-hmm. So Obama talked about the pivot to Asia, and then we changed the names twice, and then Trump came in, and the Biden strategy looks a little bit different, a little bit similar, but there's no real there on the U.S. side that's really consistent and is offering things that the Southeast Asians really want, like markets, infrastructure support, funding, and so Japan has been like really trying to fill that hole, to build up a set of incentives for everybody to act along the lines of free and open trade and investment and commerce and movement of peoples.
Leadership is the primary topic of conversation that we have on this podcast, and so I want to ask you for an assessment of the Prime Minister's leadership. And let me kind of caveat that and put out a couple of quotes, because this event has brought so many of the world leaders. It actually got the world leaders to agree on something for the first time in a long time. But President Biden said that Prime Minister Abe's vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific will endure. Prime Minister Modi of India said that he was a towering global statesman, an outstanding leader, and a remarkable administrator. And President Putin of Russia said that he was an outstanding statesman. Can you talk for a minute about leadership, and not only Prime Minister Abe's leadership in Japan, but what made him a good leader? What were those characteristics, those traits? And then also, to my kind of open about the presidency, in your mind and as an academic of international relations, what makes a great world leader?
Oh, so I may end up punting that last one back to you.
10 more hours of conversation, I know, but
but so Abe turned out to be an extraordinarily effective leader the second time around. So he was briefly prime minister in 2005 to 2006, and he kind of overplayed his hand. He threw out all these sort of nationalist wish list things like we're going to change the Constitution and we're going to institute patriotic education, and kind of took his eyes off the ball, and it lost an upper house election, and then he has ulcerative colitis, so he also got sick. But he had already taken his eyes off the ball at the beginning, and had ended up with, I think, what anybody would say is kind of a failed prime ministership. He came back in 2012 as a different person. So I would say one thing is he learned, and that's not that easy to do. He learned. He went in, he listened, he thought about what he did wrong. He adjusted in a variety of ways. One of which was he changed his prioritization. Right, rather than patriotic education, which nobody wants in Japan, really, he said, "Okay, we need to strengthen the economy in order to, not fall farther and farther behind." Instead of let's change the Constitution immediately, he says, "Okay, well let's improve our capabilities and create an international cooperative set of arrangements that can help the whole region." So he's pulling things that from in his agenda that are ones that most people could agree with, or a lot of people at least could agree with, that didn't threaten. So learning is extraordinarily important. The second is he's a pretty charismatic guy, actually. He's not a spellbinding speaker, but he's a good speaker, and he gained popularity among people for his willingness to sort of say what he thought. He also pissed off a lot of people. There were a lot of people who didn't like him, mostly because they thought he was a closet historical revisionist and nationalist, which is a bad word in Japan. But then the third thing, which is I think kind of invisible from outside the country, was he was an extremely effective inside player in the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the center-right party in Japan, which is and always has been absolutely riven by factionalism. So when you go back and you look at who was the effective leaders in Japanese post-war history, it's always the people who could somehow surmount the factionalism. And you either do it by sort of cracking the whip and making people pay if they don't go along, or through inspiring. You're building up your own faction through effective management. And he did both. And so he was the one person in Japan, and I'd argue this takes you all the way back to probably the 1950s, who had both the inside game and the outside game. He could say, I have the bully pulpit and people will follow me. It's not unique. Koizumi, who's a prime minister in the early 2000s, had done that, but he didn't have that control over his party. Koizumi basically had to threaten his party all the time. I'm just going to hold another election and you guys are going to lose. Mm-hmm. Whereas Abe was able to play the inside game. He understood where the bodies were buried, and he made compromises, which everybody does, but he did them in a really strategic way, so that incrementally, people would say, "Oh, that's not that big a change." Over 8 years, you make enough incremental changes, you've changed the country. And so I think, to me, that's a lot of the lesson of Abe, is that he learned, he strategized, he prioritized, and he was content to build towards a larger goal.
So I didn't load you up with these points before we started, but I'm going to give them to you now. So we talk about the 9 characteristics of performance that are defined by special operations forces. And these are what are used to assess and select special operators, regardless of if you're a Green Beret, a Ranger, a SEAL, MARSOC, it doesn't matter, Air Force. But it's drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, effective intelligence, team ability, curiosity, and emotional strength. And the 3 things that you just outlined for the prime minister, I would tie back to humility, effective intelligence, and team ability. So humility and the ability to look internally and self-assess yourself in an accurate way and then make change based on that. The effective intelligence to learn from the past, take the aggregate experiences of your past, figure out what went right, what went wrong, and then apply them to your future decision-making for the better. And then team ability. Can you work with everybody? Can you find common ground? Can you be a team player regardless of the situation that you're put in? And so what you just identified for him fits so well into some of the core themes that we talk about with leadership and are so important to building effective individuals and effective teams and organizations that are resilient and last over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and leadership looks different in different culture, but those attributes you're talking about are I think the ones that moved Abe forward in important ways. And one little thing that I think is not sort of hasn't been showing up that much is, and I didn't know him personally at all. I did used to work for a politician in Japan, and I've gotten to know a lot of Japanese politicians over the years. But I did not know Abe at all. But those people who know him and have dealt with him say he's a super likable guy.
Yeah.
Right.
Also, the most important thing: do people like you?
Yeah, he listens well. He can be kind. He's got his point of view, but he's not a sledgehammer or a steamroller or something like that. Even though when you sort of look at this 8-year period of when he was the prime minister, you might say, wow, that was really quite effective. He must have, and nobody else had been for the previous 6 years, so he must have just steamrolled him. And I think it's that set of combinations, the willingness to listen and the willingness to learn. Changed circumstances obviously made his message a little more attractive as well. But he worked very well with other people.
Yeah, at the end of the day, can you be a good person? That's what matters. Well, Bill, Professor, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us, talk about this impactful subject, this topic of conversation going on in the world. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate everything you're doing at BU. Certainly my heart continues to lie at BU. I spent a lot of time there today and involved in a lot of aspects of the school, and I look forward to speaking with you again. And in the next time that we have an event that is important to that region of the world and we can leverage your expertise, I hope you'll join us again.
I'd be happy to, and drop by anytime you're in the hood.
I will. Thanks. American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, Talent War Group, and our sponsor Jersey Mike Subs on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.